The log entry had no author field. That was the first thing Admiral Vethkarin noticed when the recovered file opened on her display. Not the content, not the timestamp, not the 16 flagged anomalies her intelligence staff had marked in red. Just the absence of a name where a name should have been. Every military record in the Conclave's 2,000-year database carried an author. Every battle report, every casualty notation, every supply manifest. The field existed in the template because it had always existed, because accountability was the first law of command. This file had the field, it was simply empty. She almost closed it. She had 43 other reports waiting, a fleet disposition to approve, and a council session in 6 hours that would determine whether the Armada's losses were classified as a tactical anomaly or something that required a different word entirely. A word no Conclave admiral had used in living memory. She did not close it. The first line of the log read, "They were already waiting when we arrived." The Armada had assembled at the threshold of Kethvasara, 14 light minutes from the star humans called Sol, on the 42nd day of the campaign season. It was, by any measurable standard, the greatest concentration of military force the Conclave had directed at a single target in 400 years. 712 warships, 41 dreadnoughts. The kind of force that did not win battles, it simply ended them. Planets had surrendered before such fleets reached orbital range, their leaders transmitting capitulation codes while the fleet was still decelerating, because everyone who ran the numbers reached the same conclusion. There was no version of the engagement where resistance was rational. The humans had not transmitted anything. Fleet Commander Orethsen had noted this in his pre-engagement report, filed 11 hours before the Armada entered the Sol system. He had characterized the silence as denial, a psychological stage documented in 47 prior conquest campaigns. Smaller civilizations occasionally refused contact in the final hours. It was, his report stated, an expected behavior. It required no tactical adjustment. They're not responding because they can't process the scale, his communications officer had said, pulling up the human radio traffic. It was still broadcasting, music, news, something that translated as a sporting competition. Their civilian population doesn't even know we're here yet. Orethsen had nodded. Then we give them 1 hour after emergence to transmit surrender, standard protocol. And if they don't? He had looked at the tactical display, 712 warships in perfect formation, the kind of formation that made the space between stars feel small. Then, we discover whether humans make noise when they finally understand what they're looking at. That quote was in the official record. Vethkarin had read it 3 times. Orethsen had been reported missing 71 minutes after that conversation. The Armada emerged from Fold space at 3:47 hours, Earth Standard Time, a timestamp the Conclave Intelligence Division had only been able to establish afterward, by correlating the humans' own records. The emergence was textbook. 712 ships transitioned within a 40-second window, forming up across a defensive shell 300,000 kilometers wide, exactly as rehearsed. From Earth's surface, the event would have been visible to the naked eye as a sudden brightening against the stars. 700 points of light appearing simultaneously in the pre-dawn sky, like a constellation being switched on. The Conclave had done this before. The light show was deliberate. It was the first message, look at what is above you. What no one in the Armada expected was that people on Earth's surface were already looking. Not because they had detected the Fold signatures, human sensor technology was decades too primitive for that. They were looking because 17 minutes before the Armada emerged, every major human military installation on the planet had received an alert. Not from their own systems, from something that had been sitting, powered down and silent, in a stable orbit between Earth and its moon for 11 days, waiting for exactly the Fold space displacement signature that preceded Conclave emergence. Someone had placed it there. Vethkarin read that section of the recovered log twice, then read it again. The device, humans were calling it a tripwire in their own after-action reports, a word that apparently referred to an ancient mechanical trap, had been placed by a human team. That much was established. What was not established, what had not been established despite 6 weeks of conclave intelligence review, was which human team. The planet had hundreds of separate military organizations operating under dozens of distinct governmental structures, none of which appeared to have coordinated this action through any channel the conclave had intercepted. Someone had known the Armada was coming. Someone had not told anyone else they knew. And in the 17 minutes between the tripwire's alert and the Armada's emergence, something had happened on Earth's surface that the conclave's orbital sensors had not detected, because the conclave's orbital sensors had not yet been deployed. The humans had 17 minutes. What they did with them was the part of the record that had caused 3 of Vethkarin's senior analysts to request reassignment. Tactical Coordinator CL Vast was 26 minutes into her shift when the alert reached her station at the Northern European Command Node, and she did exactly what her training had prepared her to do. Nothing dramatic. No shouting. No panic. She looked at the signal classification, confirmed it matched the profile they had been briefed on 8 months ago, and opened a single encrypted channel. This is Vast Authorization Kestrel 9. The package is real. Execute standing orders. A voice on the other end, calm as arithmetic, confirmed. Time to execution 14 minutes. She closed the channel and began her own checklist. There were 47 items on it. She had rehearsed it so many times that her hands moved through the sequence before her conscious mind had fully caught up with the situation. That was the point of the rehearsal. By the time she was aware she was afraid, she had already completed items 1 through 19. Item 20 was the one she had never quite believed she would actually do. She did it anyway. The Armada's first indication that something was wrong came not from weapons fire, not from enemy ships, not from any of the threat categories their tactical systems were designed to detect. It came from silence. Specifically, the absence of the civilian radio traffic that had been continuously broadcasting from Earth's surface until 31 seconds after the Armada's emergence. Music, news, sports, the warm, chaotic noise of a civilization that did not know it was about to be asked to kneel. It stopped. All of it. Every frequency simultaneously. Communication failure. The Armada's signals officer had flagged it immediately because simultaneous cessation across all bands was not a pattern that occurred naturally, or deliberate blackout. No one on the Armada's bridge had an answer because the question itself implied something uncomfortable. Deliberate by whom, and for what purpose? The humans' military channels had also gone silent, which meant either their command structure had collapsed in the first 30 seconds, possible, perhaps even likely given the shock of the Armada's appearance, or they had switched to a communication method the conclave's sensors could not detect. The fleet began its standard approach. Protocol required a 1-hour window for surrender transmission before any hostile action. Orath Sen gave the order to hold formation and advance at 1/3 standard thrust. At the 4-minute mark, one of the Armada's outer shell dreadnoughts reported a proximity contact. Small, fast-moving, metallic signature. The report described it as likely debris, a satellite or defunct spacecraft disturbed by the fold emergence shockwave. 18 seconds later, the contact detonated at a distance of 60 meters from the dreadnought's forward hull. The explosion did not damage the dreadnought. The Conclave built their warships to survive far worse. The blast was noted in the tactical log as negligible, the contact reclassified as an automated defense mine. Primitive, scattered, the kind of thing a civilization deployed when it had no real defense and wanted to gesture toward one. 3 more contacts were reported in the following 90 seconds, all detonated, all negligible. Orath Sen marked the first formal human response in his command log. Automated mines, low yield, no tactical relevance. Consistent with a civilization aware of our approach but unable to mount a credible defense. Proceeding. He was not wrong about the mines being low yield. He was catastrophically wrong about their purpose. Vethkaran paused the log file at this point and looked at her analyst, a young officer named Preth who had been standing quietly at the edge of her office for the last 20 minutes, apparently waiting to be noticed. The mines, she said, were they intended to damage the fleet? Preth had clearly been hoping she would ask a different question. He took a careful breath. No, Admiral. Human after-action documentation, recovered from a facility that survived the engagement, indicates the mines were calibrated specifically to not cause meaningful damage. She looked at him for a long moment. Then what were they for? Mapping. He held up a data tablet. Each detonation emitted a short-range electromagnetic pulse. The pulse wasn't targeted at our ships. It was targeted at our ship's exterior sensor arrays. It caused a reboot cycle in the affected arrays. The cycle lasted approximately 4.3 seconds per array. He paused. The humans were using the mine detonations to generate precise windows where our outer hull sensors were blind. The room was quiet. They knew our sensor reboot cycle, Vethkaran said. Yes. How? Preth set the tablet down carefully. That is one of the questions we have not answered. She turned back to the log. The entry below the mine analysis was written in a different style than the sections above it, shorter sentences, less formal syntax, as if whoever had written it had been shaking. The Armada crossed the 800,000-kilometer threshold at the 31-minute mark. Earth was visible on the tactical display now. A blue sphere, smaller than it would eventually become but unmistakable. The planet humanity called home with an emotional intensity that conclave xenopsychologists had flagged in their profile reports as statistically unusual. Most civilizations at this developmental stage showed moderate territorial attachment. Humans showed something the psychologists had categorized, somewhat uncertainly, as disproportionate asterisk. The word they had actually used in the original report was irrational. Orath Sen had read that report. He had considered it useful context. He was looking at Earth on his display when the second thing went wrong. It went wrong quietly. The Armada's outer formation ships began registering minor power fluctuations in their navigation systems, not failures, not damage, just small inconsistencies that the onboard systems were correcting automatically. The kind of fluctuations you might expect from fold space residue, from trace radiation, from a dozen mundane sources. The Armada's engineers logged them as routine. They were not routine. 22 of the Armada's 712 ships had been silently moved 3 degrees off their designated formation positions during those fluctuation events. The movement was small enough that no tactical officer noticed it. The ship's own navigation systems had accepted the positional drift as a corrective adjustment, because the drift precisely mimicked the signature of fold space stabilization compensation, a signal that every conclave navigation system was pre-programmed to accept and execute without command confirmation. Someone had written that signal from scratch. Someone who had, somehow, obtained the proprietary encoding key for conclave navigation compensation protocols. Those 22 ships were now positioned at intervals that, when plotted on a formation map, did not form a recognizable pattern. They looked like drift. They looked like noise. The Armada's tactical computer analyzed the formation twice and returned no anomaly flag. The pattern would only become recognizable later, in the after-action reconstructions, when conclave analysts plotted the positions against a map of the engagement that followed. When they did, They found that the 22 displaced ships were spaced to create, at a precise moment during the engagement, 17 overlapping crossfire corridors within the Armada's own formation. The humans had spent 11 days silently repositioning the Armada's own ships to shoot each other. Veth-Karen reached the end of that section and realized she had stopped breathing at some point. She did not know exactly when. She found Preth in the analysis corridor outside her office. He had not left, which meant he had been waiting for her to reach this part. "The navigation signal," she said. "How long had it been broadcasting?" "Our best estimate is 9 days before the Armada's emergence." He paused. "From within the formation's intended deployment zone." "Something was already there." "Yes. We swept that zone before the Armada transited." "Yes." Another pause. "The object was broadcasting on a frequency our sweep protocols do not scan. The frequency is used exclusively by conclave navigation systems for internal synchronization. It would not appear on a standard sensor sweep because our sensor systems are programmed to classify that frequency as own ship traffic and filter it from the threat display." The silence stretched. "Someone programmed a device to speak our own language," she said, "and hid it in the one place we were guaranteed not to look." Preth looked like he had been carrying this information for several days and was relieved to no longer be carrying it alone. "Yes, Admiral." "Who built it?" He said nothing. She walked back to her office. She had reached the section of the log marked, in the original file, with a notation she had not previously encountered in any conclave military record. The notation was a standard flag color, the amber of unresolved classification, but the text beside it was not standard. Someone had typed by hand in clear conclave script. "We still do not know who she was." Ciel Vashti completed item 20 of her checklist at the 41-second mark after the alert, which meant she was 19 seconds ahead of the rehearsed timeline. She noted this with the detached satisfaction of someone who had trained for a specific moment and was now inside it, and moved to item 21. Item 21 required her to make a second call. This one was not encrypted. It went over civilian emergency broadcast infrastructure, and it went to every emergency management system on the continent simultaneously, using a code that would be interpreted as a natural disaster alert. Earthquake, tsunami, nuclear facility incident. The specific classification did not matter. What mattered was that the alert would push people away from windows and toward interior shelter. She did not know if it would work. She had not known during any of the rehearsals whether it would work. The variable was human behavior under unexpected stress, and human behavior under unexpected stress was, even for humans, difficult to model. What she knew was that the Armada would be visible from the surface in approximately 14 minutes. She knew that 700 ships appearing in the sky simultaneously would cause a specific category of response in a large portion of the population. They would go outside to look. She could not stop that response entirely. She could delay it, scatter it, reduce the density of civilians in exposed areas during the first critical window. She sent the alert and moved to item 22. Item 22 was the last item she personally controlled. After that, standing orders took over, executed by people she had never met, in facilities she had never visited, doing things she had only been briefed on in the abstract. She sat at her console and watched the incoming data streams and thought, for a brief and entirely unproductive moment, about how strange it was that the fate of the species had come down to a checklist. Then the first explosion registered on her board, not from space, not from the Armada, from beneath the Atlantic Ocean, then another 5 seconds later, then a third. She had not known about those, which meant she was not the only person with a checklist. The explosions registered on the Armada's sensors as seismic events, which was exactly what they were. The Conclave's geology models flagged the events as minor, shallow ocean floor disturbances, probably triggered by fold emergence shockwave propagation through Earth's hydrosphere. The models marked them as natural. They were not natural. The ocean floor detonations had opened 3 specific channels in the Atlantic seabed at precise coordinates, through geological strata that had been surveyed and modeled in detail. The channels were not large. Each was roughly 4 meters in diameter at the narrowest point, but they connected the ocean floor to a series of artificial chambers that had been constructed in total secrecy over a period of 22 months. The chambers flooded in 6 minutes. The flooding activated a pressure-based mechanical system that required no electronics, no power grid, no signals that could be detected or jammed. The system was purely hydraulic, water pressure moving pistons, pistons engaging levers, levers doing what levers do. In 11 locations across the Atlantic seabed, structures that had been invisible to orbital survey because they were built below the acoustic noise floor of the ocean, invisible to every kind of scan the conclave had performed, began, without any electronic command signal, to unfold. The Armada's sensors saw them emerge at the 47-minute mark. By that point, the Armada had been inside the Sol system for 16 minutes and had not yet fired a single weapon. They were still waiting out the surrender window. The tactical officer who first identified the seabed structures transmitted a request for classification to the fleet's Xenotech division. The Xenotech division examined the sensor returns for 90 seconds and then transmitted back 4 words. "We don't know what those are." Vethkaran had read that transmission before. It appeared in the official preliminary report, the one that had been distributed to the council with extensive redaction. She had always found the 4 words inadequate, a non-answer dressed as a statement. Now, reading the full log, she understood why the Xenotech division had transmitted exactly that. Because what the sensors were returning was not a classification problem. It was a comprehension problem. The structures were not weapons platforms. They were not missile silos. They were not any category of military installation the Conclave had encountered in 400 years of expansion. They were, as far as the Xenotech analysts could determine, enormous acoustic arrays, the kind used for communication. But they were not pointed at the Armada. They were pointed at each other. And at the 49-minute mark, they began broadcasting, not to the Armada, not to Earth's surface, not to any target the Armada could identify. The broadcast propagated through the ocean itself, using the deep-water acoustic channel that Earth's own militaries had developed for submarine communication. The signal traveled at the speed of sound, not light, which made it, by any logical military metric, comically slow. Orath Sen had dismissed the broadcast as irrelevant within seconds of being briefed on it. He had been dead for 4 minutes by the time the analysts who survived figured out what the broadcast actually was. It was a timing signal, a single, continuous, ocean-spanning pulse, the kind of signal you send when you need hundreds of separate systems, none of which are electronically connected to each other, to do something at exactly the same moment. The arrays had been running for 11 minutes when the coordinated action executed. It was not the action anyone in the Armada had anticipated. It was not missiles, not energy weapons, not the kind of kinetic assault a space-capable civilization might attempt, and a Type 0 civilization was not supposed to be able to manage. It was something the Conclave had no defensive protocol for, because the Conclave had never imagined a Type 0 civilization would attempt it. It was a question of geometry, and of patience, and of knowing something about Conclave dreadnoughts that no one outside the Conclave was supposed to know. A Conclave dreadnought's strongest armor faces forward and laterally. The aft quarter, the engineering section, the drive manifolds, the fold coil housings, has lighter shielding because the physics of fold space generation require heat dissipation, and heavy armor interferes with the dissipation geometry. It was an engineering compromise that the Conclave had managed for 2 centuries through simple tactical doctrine. You never allowed an enemy to get behind your dreadnoughts in force, because getting behind them required defeating your escort formation first, and your escort formation was the strongest part of your fleet. The 22 ships that the humans had silently repositioned were the escort formation's inner layer. When the acoustic timing signal completed its pulse, the repositioned ships received a second navigation correction. A larger one, sent through the same spoofed frequency, unmistakably deliberate now, making no attempt at camouflage. The ship's navigation systems executed the correction before any human officer could countermand it, because the signal carried the authentication signature of the Armada's own fleet command. Authentication signatures that had never been transmitted in the Sol system. Authentication signatures that existed only inside the Armada's own encrypted command architecture. Somewhere, somehow, someone had read the Armada's mail. The repositioned ships moved 3 seconds after the timing pulse completed. They moved directly into crossfire corridors their new positions had already calculated. The 17 overlapping corridors were not aimed at Earth. They were aimed at the 41 dreadnoughts. The aft quarter. How many were we using? Veth-Karen heard her own voice from a distance, as if someone else had asked the question. Preth understood what she was asking. Current assessment is that the navigation compromise affected between 22 and 29 ships. The outer range is uncertain because we cannot confirm which ships received the signal and declined to execute versus which ships were not targeted. Ships that declined to execute. 3 vessels reported navigational anomalies to their commanding officers during the approach. Those officers ordered manual override and held position. All 3 vessels survived the initial engagement phase. He met her eyes. The commanders who received those reports and did not override did not survive. She sat with that for a moment. The humans knew that overriding the system was an option, she said. They didn't try to prevent it. They just counted on the fact that most commanders would trust the system. Yes, they studied us. For what our analysts estimate is between 4 and 7 years. He set another tablet on the desk. This is the section you have not reached yet. The engagement lasted 53 minutes from first contact to the cessation of organized conclave resistance. Veth-Karen had known that figure from the first reports. She had not known, had not been permitted to know until now, until this log, what those 53 minutes actually contained. The repositioned ship's misfire into the dreadnought formation had destroyed or mission-killed 14 of the 41 dreadnoughts in the first 90 seconds. The survivors broke formation to assess the damage, which scattered the escort screen, which created the openings the Earth-based weapon systems had been waiting to exploit. But it was not the weapon systems that broke the Armada. The weapons were effective. They were devastating in ways that no Type 0 civilization should have been capable of, using delivery mechanisms that the Conclave's point defense systems were not calibrated to intercept because they traveled at angles and velocities that assumed a weapon fired not at targets, but at where targets would be *30 to 60 seconds in the future. The humans had clearly modeled Conclave evasion behavior with extraordinary precision. But even that was not what broke the Armada. The Armada's tactical doctrine included contingency planning for partial fleet destruction. 40% losses were considered recoverable if command integrity was maintained. 60% losses were considered recoverable if fold space retreat was achievable. The Conclave had war-gamed scenarios far worse than what the first 90 seconds of the Sol engagement produced. What the war games had never modeled was the third element. The one Orathsen had included in his log exactly once. In a transmission he managed to complete 19 seconds before his flagship's bridge lost power. The transmission was only 7 words. They knew exactly where I was standing. Ciel Vast had been monitoring the engagement data for 11 minutes when her console flagged the transmission frequency. She stared at it for 3 full seconds before she understood what she was looking at. Someone, not her, not anyone in her chain of command, was transmitting directly to the Armada's flagship using the Conclave's own secure command channel, transmitting from Earth's surface, from somewhere in the Pacific Basin. Not a weapon, not a hack, not an attempt to jam or disrupt. A message, in Conclave formal script, addressed personally to Orath Sen by name and rank and birth registry designation, a string of identifiers that no human should have possessed. She could not decode the transmission. She did not have access to the cipher, but she could see that it was being sent, and she could see that the flagship acknowledged receipt of it, and she could see that the flagship's maneuvering systems activated 8 seconds after the acknowledgement. The flagship moved. A small movement, a heading correction, the kind of micro-adjustment a commander might order to improve a tactical sightline. The movement placed Orath Sen's bridge, the specific section of the flagship that housed the commander's station, at an angle the human targeting systems had been waiting for. She never found out what the message said. The analysis team that eventually worked through the cipher recovered only a fragment, a partial decode that may have been a translation error or may have been exactly what it appeared to be. The fragment read, "Please look out the window." The Armada's command structure fragmented completely at the 51-minute mark. Not because the ships were destroyed, enough survived, wounded and scattered, to have maintained a coherent fighting force under unified command. But unified command required commanders, and the humans had spent years identifying, locating, and modeling the behavioral patterns of every flag rank officer the Armada carried. Not to kill them all. That would have been impossible, and the humans apparently did not pursue the impossible when the achievable was sufficient. They killed the ones whose absence would cause paralysis, rather than the ones whose absence would simply cause anger. It was the most alien thing about the engagement, in the Conclave's collective accounting of it afterward, more alien than the acoustic arrays, more alien than the navigation compromise, more alien than the precision targeting. It was the evidence that the humans had looked at the Armada's 712 ships and 712 commanders and asked, very calmly, which of these people specifically do we need to remove for this structure to lose its ability to function? And had answered that question correctly. The survivors began fold space retreats at the 53-minute mark. Not all of them made it. The fold coil damage from the aft quarter strikes was severe enough that 11 ships' fold drives failed on activation, and a failed fold drive was not a recoverable event. But the majority retreated. They reached the edge of the Sol system and they left, because there was nothing left to do, because whatever they had expected to find at this star with its blue planet had turned out to be wrong in ways that 700 warships could not fix. Vethkarin closed the log file. She sat for a long time. Outside her office, the station was operating normally, the sounds of a fleet headquarters doing fleet headquarters things, unbothered, because the people walking those corridors had access to the preliminary reports with their careful language and their redactions, but not to what she had just read. She thought about the tripwire, 11 days in orbit before the Armada's emergence. She thought about the navigation signal, 9 days of silent repositioning. She thought about the acoustic arrays built over 22 months in the depths of an ocean. She thought about whoever had placed the message in Orath Sen's command channel, "Please look out the window." She thought about the authentication signatures, the Armada's own encrypted identifiers, used against itself, stolen from communications that had never been transmitted in the Sol system, which meant they had been stolen elsewhere in the years before the campaign, from some other context the Conclave had not yet identified. She thought about the fact that the humans had done all of this, the years of preparation, the layered contingencies, the surgical removal of exactly the right commanders, as a civilization that had never before encountered the Conclave, who had never seen a Conclave warship, who had been watching lights move in the sky and inferring from those lights, from whatever fragments of information they had managed to collect, the entire interior structure of the thing that was eventually coming to kill them. She thought about the empty author field at the top of the log. We still do not know who she was. She had assumed, reading that notation, that it referred to Vashti, the coordinator, the checklist, the woman who had sent the earthquake alert and heard the unexpected explosions. But Vashti was identified. Vashti was in the human records, named and ranked and documented. The notation was about someone else. Someone who had left no name in any human record either, who appeared only as an absence in the navigation compromise, in the authentication signature theft, in the acoustic array designs that no recovered human engineering document fully explained. A gap in the shape of a person, visible only because of what surrounded it. Whoever had designed the response to the Armada's arrival had not designed it as a single system. They had designed it as a series of independent systems, each one complete in itself, none of them requiring any of the others to function. If the tripwire had failed, the navigation compromise still worked. If the navigation compromise had been detected and overridden, the aft quarter targeting still worked. If the targeting had been defeated, the command structure decapitation still worked. It was not a plan. It was a philosophy. Remove any one piece and the remaining pieces adapted. Destroy any layer and the next layer was already moving. The Conclave's tactical doctrine was built on the assumption that a civilization's military was an expression of its technology. Better technology equaled better military. It was the most reliable metric in 400 years of expansion. You assessed the technological level. You projected the military capability. You deployed appropriate force, and the outcome was arithmetic. The humans had built something that was not an expression of their technology. They had built an expression of their patience, of their willingness to spend years preparing for a moment that might not come, or that might come differently than anticipated, or that they might not survive to see. Of their capacity to coordinate across hidden channels, to maintain silence across thousands of people for years, to hold contingency, inside contingency, without anyone losing their nerve or breaking the silence, or deciding the threat wasn't real enough to justify the sacrifice. Of their willingness to do all of it without knowing if it would work. Because it might not have worked, any of it. The navigation compromise required the Armada's commanders to trust their systems, and 3 of them hadn't. The authentication signatures required the Armada to use its encrypted channels in a recoverable context, and that recovery had not been complete. Some signatures were missing, some gaps remained, some ships had not been compromised. The command decapitation required models of individual behavioral patterns that could have been wrong, and some of them had been wrong, and those officers had survived. The humans had built a plan knowing it would be imperfect. They had built it anyway, stacked it deep, and accepted that an imperfect plan executed with absolute commitment would defeat a perfect plan held by an enemy who could not imagine what they were looking at. Vethkarin picked up the data tablet Preth had left on her desk, the section she had not yet reached. It was a single recovered document, partially damaged, from a human facility that had not survived the engagement. The document was classified in the human system at a level that had no direct translation into conclave classification terminology. Because the human system had categories the conclave did not use, not because the conclave lacked the concepts, but because the conclave had never needed to classify information from its own citizens about its own potential destruction from outside forces. The document was not a tactical manual. It was not an engineering specification. It was, as far as the analysis team could determine, a letter. From one person to a planning committee, written 14 months before the Armada's arrival, during a period when the humans apparently did not yet know if the conclave was real or when it would arrive. The letter's author was not named. The letter said, in part, "You're going to tell me we don't know enough. You're right, we don't. We're going to plan for 17 different versions of what they might bring, and they're going to bring the 18th. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's the condition. We build to the condition, not the estimate. We build things that work when we're wrong, because we're going to be wrong about something. The only thing I can promise you with certainty is that when they come, and they are coming, I do not have a doubt about that, they will have seen civilization surrender at the sight of what they've assembled. They will expect us to react the way those civilizations reacted. The most powerful thing we can do is not react that way, not because we're brave. Because we've had more time to think about this than they think we have. And the one advantage we have is that they don't know how long we've been watching." The letter ended there. The rest was unrecoverable. Vethkaran set the tablet down. Outside the station's viewport, the stars were where they had always been. Stable, mapped, known. The conclave had cataloged every system within 800 light-years, every resource, every civilization, every potential obstacle to the expansion that was simply what the conclave did, had always done, because the expansion was the purpose, and the purpose had never needed examination because it had always worked. She thought about a civilization on a single planet, watching lights move in the sky. Watching for years. Building in the ocean floor, building in orbit, building in the gaps between their enemies' assumptions. Not because they were certain they could win. Because they had decided, without ceremony, without guarantee, and apparently without anyone's name attached to the decision, that asterisk stopping was the one thing they were unwilling to do. She would have to write a report. The council would want recommendations, updated force doctrine, new threat classifications, a revised approach to the question of the Sol system. They would want a strategy. She had no strategy to give them. She had only what the log contained, and what the log contained was a problem that did not resolve into a strategy, because the thing that had destroyed the Armada was not a weapon or a tactic or a technology. It was a disposition, a quality of mind. The particular kind of patience that comes not from confidence but from a decision made in the dark, by people who understood that the cost of being ready was very high and the cost of not being ready was higher, and who had simply, quietly, without announcement, without any author field filled in, gotten to work. The conclave had faced civilizations with larger fleets. It had faced civilizations with superior technology, with older histories, with resources that dwarfed humanity's by orders of magnitude. It had never, in 400 years, faced a civilization that had spent years learning how to lose in ways the conclave could not survive. She stared at the empty author field on the log. We still do not know who she was. She thought perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the most important thing the humans had built was not the tripwire, not the acoustic arrays, not the navigation compromise. Perhaps the most important thing was the decision, taken at some unrecorded moment by someone who left no name in any file, that the response to an unstoppable force was not a stronger force, but a different kind of patience. The patience to become invisible, to become diffuse. To spread the plan across so many people and so many systems, and so many hidden channels that you could not kill it by killing any one part of it. To build something that survived the people who built it. She closed the file. She held the silence of her office around her for one more moment. Then she began to write, in the first line of her report to the council, the words she knew they did not want to read, the words that changed everything the conclave believed about the shape of the galaxy and its place inside it. The humans were ready for us before we knew they existed. I recommend we determine what else they have been ready for, because I do not believe the Armada was the only contingency they prepared. I do not believe we have yet seen the layer they built for the scenario where the Armada failed and we came back." She paused, added one more line.